Russia would expel 60 US diplomats and close the American consulate in St. Petersburg, emulating Washington's move over the Skripal poisoning case. Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov announced the retaliatory measures against the US and pledged a mirror response to other states that have deported Moscow's diplomats.
Retaliatory measures include the expulsion of the same number of US diplomats and withdrawal of our consent for the US consulate in St. Petersburg. As far as other states are concerned, we will always give a mirror response.
As it promised, Russia has responded, tit for tat. For every Russian diplomat kicked out from the 24 or so countries, one of their diplomats will be kicked out of Russia. Almost all of those countries, by the way, either NATO members or hopefuls. The United States, though, may have to charter a jet. 60 of its diplomats have been ordered to leave Russia, the same number kicked out by Washington. Oh, and the US consulate in St. Petersburg is being closed down in response to the closure of Russia's consulate in Seattle. A mirror response, no more, no less. And again, Moscow has called on the United States to stop.
It is proposed to US authorities, inciting and fueling the smear campaign against our country, to rethink and curb their reckless actions, destroying bilateral relations.
To sum up, Russia, which vehemently denies any role in this poisoning, says never before have we witnessed such mockery of international law. It has also convened a special meeting of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. OPCW has sent technical experts to examine the substance with which the former Russian double agent and his daughter were poisoned. But their investigation will be technical.
OPCW experts have arrived in London to analyze the substance used in the alleged poisoning of Sergey and Yulia Skripal. This will only allow them to distinguish the chemical formula of the substance. The OPCW Technical Secretariat doesn't have the mandate to verify the UK's allegations. By the way, the investigation into the case is still ongoing.
The UK and its allies insist that Russia was behind this. Russia denies any such thing and says that this entire affair is politically motivated. There's been no investigation, no trial, no evidence, only accusations, which have taken a turn for the literary.
It's rather like the beginning of Crime and Punishment. You remember Crime and Punishment, my Lord Mayor? Lord Mayor looking wise as a tree full of owls at this point. We're all confident about the identity of the culprit, and the only question is whether he will first confess or be caught.
Boris, have you read Crime and Punishment to the end? You know, unlike you, we have read Dostoevsky. Especially for Boris Johnson, the Dostoevsky quote translated in English.
From 100 rabbits, you can not make a horse. 100 suspicions don't make a proof.
Boris Johnson went on to cement his case by saying that, unlike Russia, which makes deadly poisons, Britain manufactures non-existent, imaginary, fantasy weapons that don't work.
You need to know about the difference between modern Britain and the government of Vladimir Putin. Seriously, they make Novichok. We make lightsabers. One is a hideous weapon specifically designed for assassination. The other is an implausible theatrical prop with a mysterious buzz that plainly wouldn't harm anybody.
Opinion is divided on what exactly Boris Johnson meant or how exactly he hoped this would help his case.
However, the diplomatic standoff threatens to continue escalating as Washington says it may respond further to Moscow's moves.
Reserve the right further to any Russian retaliation against the United States. So we are reading this, we are reviewing it, and will respond accordingly.
Well, State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert there claims Russia is isolating itself through its response to the expulsion of Russian diplomats from the US. RT's Samira Khan has more.
Well, believe it or not, the diplomatic spat between the U.S. and Russia has escalated even further. Just after Russia announced their tit-for-tat response, the U.S. is now considering new options against Russia. And just to remind our viewers, Washington expelled 60 Russian diplomats and closed Russia's consulate in Seattle just after London claimed without any evidence that Russia was behind the alleged poisoning of a former double agent and his daughter on British soil. And in retaliation, Moscow asked the same number of diplomats to leave. Now, even though it was a tit-for-tat measure, the State Department argued that there is no justification for the Russian response, and Russia is supposedly isolating itself from the world. And reporters seemed puzzled as to why Moscow's move wasn't justified and continued to push for more clarification.
I want to remind you that there is no justification for the Russian response.
I'm not sure I understand. You guys threw out 60 of their people.
We don't see this as a diplomatic tit for tat.
The American diplomats who are being expelled are not spies under diplomatic cover?
I'm saying that they work for the U.S. State Department. They are our colleagues who have served there with great distinction.
But you're saying that your action was justified, theirs wasn't, because these people aren't the equivalent of who
I think we're forgetting what got us to this place.
Well, Nauer dodged questions about whether the expelled U.S. diplomats were spies or not, and then reporters pushed again to understand why the State Department considers Moscow's actions to be wrong. And it seems that Washington is forcing Moscow to take responsibility and humbly accept punishment for a crime that there's no evidence for.
Essentially, you're asking Russia to just admit that they did it and take their punishment.
Wouldn't
right?
that be the adult thing to do?
They're saying that they didn't. You are, in fact, asking them to, admit to something that they say that they didn't.
And you know what? There's nothing wrong with admitting wrongdoing.
Well, Nauer went on to make some very incendiary comments to justify, quote, expressing solidarity with the UK, calling the expelled diplomats Russian spies, saying that the U.S. is better off without Russian spies, when there's no evidence that they were spies either. And so now we're just going to have to wait and see where this all goes from here.
Indeed, and to discuss where it all goes from here, we can cross live now to former US diplomat John Graham. John, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, as we were saying there, how will these retaliatory measures affect relations between Washington and Moscow? We're going round in circles here. And the processing of visas to Russian citizens maybe wanting to visit the US. What's the impact here?
Well, first of all, my sympathies go out to that poor woman in the State Department being put up in front and having to say those things. Second, I live near Seattle, and I'm not particularly being offended, I'm not being hurt. The next time I have to go to Russia, I can get a visa someplace else. But I think it's important, for everyone to understand the realities behind all the smoke screens. And one of the realities is that almost certainly the so-called diplomats on both sides were, in fact, spies. That's what nations do. Russia has spies in this country. We have spies in your country. I suspect even the people from Malawi have spies in this country, whatever. It's just part of statecraft. So the first thing you do when you're doing the tit for tat is you throw the other fellow's spies out. So that's one thing. The second thing is about the whodunit aspect of all this. Now, I keep looking at all this. I've gone on the web and looked at the formulas for Novichok, the nerve agent. It's very unstable. It's very dangerous stuff to handle. You have to be an expert to handle it or you'll kill yourself. So the question is, why on earth, if you wanted to assassinate Mr. Skripal and his daughter, why would you use such a dangerous weapon? He's sitting on a park bench. Why not just go up behind him and shoot him in the back of the head? So I come to the conclusion that basically the nerve agent was used because the person that did it knew it would be traced back to the Kremlin, because the stuff actually was invented, made, and weaponized originally by the Russians. And I don't care what the OPCW, that international organization, says in 2 weeks. It's pretty obvious because these things all have a fingerprint on them. The stuff was Novichok. But that doesn't mean the Russians did it. It wasn't invented by the Russians. So anyway, if it was not done by criminals, then by whom? If it was done by the Russian state, why on earth would the Russian state want to do that? unless Mr. Putin drastically miscalculated, and he's a very good chess player, but if he drastically miscalculated and underestimated the West's response, well, that's one explanation. Or perhaps it was some ultra-nationalists in the Soviet Union, or perhaps, in Russia, or perhaps it was some false flag operation by someone that just wanted to increase the chaos between the United States and Russia. Those things aren't.
And on that particular point then, John, as you're saying, let's go back to the issues here about in terms of the response here. The US State Department was quick to react, says it reserves the right to respond. I mean, what measures could it take? Could this escalate or de-escalate, and what measures could the US take?
Well, I think we have one more consulate in Russia. You have one more consulate here. I think it's in Dallas, if I'm not mistaken. We could close that. We could send your ambassador home, persona non grata. You could close our remaining consulate. Where is it? Yekaterinburg, I think. I'm mispronouncing the name. I'm sorry. And you could declare our ambassador persona non grata. And it goes on and on. And as I said, I think just 2 days ago on this same show, what I find most alarming, both in terms of the politicians and the spokespeople on both sides and a whole lot of the media, is that nobody seems to understand the danger of these steady escalations. And that's the real danger. We're looking now at 6 months now of steady escalations and deteriorating relationships between the U.S. and Russia. It began with the threats of abrogating the intermediate range missile treaty for Europe. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Putin announces some tremendous new weapons that the Russians have. At the same time, Trump announces a new defense budget with a lot more money for modernizing America's nuclear weapons, and so on and so on. And now it's even scarier because Mr. Putin has won an election, which means that there's very little opposition to him in Russia, and that's always dangerous. And on our side of the water, Mr. Trump is under investigation for possible collusion between his people and the Russians over tampering in U.S. elections. Indeed. That could get Trump thrown out of office.
Indeed.
And all these.
John, I'm sorry, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there as we're running out of time. John Graham, former US diplomat, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts. Thank you.
Sure.